It was a year ago tomorrow that George Floyd was murdered at the hands of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. That death sparking protests around the country for months.
Chris Sadeghi with us this morning live. And Chris, today is the start of a full week of demonstrations in Dallas.
Yeah, to mark 1 year of George Floyd's death, there are events planned not just in Dallas, but across the country all week as this nation still grapples with changes to policing. These are just some of the events that happened across the country over the weekend. Places like Houston, New York. His family took part in a march in Minneapolis, the city where he was murdered. Here in North Texas, the Next Generation Action Network has speaker events all week, including a march to Dallas PD headquarters planned for tomorrow. In Washington, President Joe Biden will host Floyd's family at the White House tomorrow. Last month, Biden urged the passing of the George Floyd Policing Act that would set federal standards to ban chokeholds and no-knock warrants, plus establish a national registry for police misconduct. Here in Texas, there's also a bill in the legislature that would ban neck restraints by police officers. There's also two bills that would increase transparency when it comes to departments knowing about an officer's past misconduct at previous departments before they hire them. But with just 1 week remaining in the legislative session, it is a race against the clock to get enough support to pass them into law. As for the officers involved in Floyd's death, Derek Chauvin was convicted earlier in this year for his murder. He is awaiting sentencing that will happen on June 25th. The three other officers are awaiting trials of their own in March of 2022. Kara, back to you.
In the year since Floyd's death, a national dialogue on police reform has taken center stage. But is that dialogue actually bringing change? Police departments across the country were under pressure after Floyd's death, so they started reviewing their procedures, training and hiring. Some cities took steps toward greater accountability for officers and instituted some changes to use of force policies. In Dallas, the police department banned chokeholds and added a duty to intervene policy, meaning officers need to step in if they see another officer doing something wrong. But as more law enforcement agencies see a value in having a force that reflects the racial diversity of the community, ABC News found that there's widespread discrepancies, and new analysis of Census Bureau data found that in 99 of the country's 100 largest metro areas, the share of police officers who are white is larger than the share of residents who are white. Now, the investigation shows that in areas where the police force was 90% white, black people were 5 times more likely to be arrested than white people. But when police of color made up half the force, black people were arrested at only 2 times the rate of white people. President Biden has wanted lawmakers to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act by tomorrow, but that won't happen. Talks continue as lawmakers say getting real reform is more important than rushing to meet a target date. So we'll have some in-depth coverage of that tomorrow on Daybreak, marking 1 year since George Floyd died.